The winds screamed across the barren expanse of Theros 4, carrying with them the electric bite of an impending storm. Elias Van crouched low, his breathing steady despite the icy gusts cutting through his combat suit. The scope of his rifle gleamed faintly as it tracked a distant shimmer barely perceptible against the craggy terrain. Something was there, just outside the range of conventional detection. 3 clicks southeast, Elias muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. His hands moved with mechanical precision, calibrating his rifle to account for the erratic gusts and electromagnetic interference, saturating the area. To most, Theros 4 was an uninhabitable wasteland. To Elias, it was a playground for precision. His earpiece crackled faintly, a weak connection to the outpost command. Then, status report. We're losing telemetry with your zone. Telemetry's the least of your worries, Elias replied flatly, his eyes never leaving the shimmer. They're here. Silent blades. At least 6, maybe more. A pause. Then, confirmed visual? Elias smirked. Not yet. But I can feel them. I don't miss. The calm went dead, leaving him alone with the storm and the faint, shifting mirage in his scope. The Silent Blades, the Galactic Empire's most elite assassins, had finally arrived. Their mission was simple: eliminate the human coalition's most dangerous sniper. Elias knew their reputation, their methods, their tech. Cloaking devices, neural dampeners, reflex enhancers, tools meant to make them unstoppable. But they weren't hunting a standard target. Elias Venn wasn't prey. His finger hovered near the trigger, patience etched into every fiber of his being. The shimmer moved again, this time accompanied by the faintest flicker of light as the storm momentarily exposed an assassin's cloaking field. Elias didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the air like thunder, and the shimmer dropped instantly. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. 1 down. 5 more, maybe more. He adjusted his position, pulling back into the shadows of a jagged outcrop. He knew what would come next. The Silent Blades would recalibrate, adjust their tactics. They would become the hunters they were trained to be. Elias checked the tripwires he'd rigged earlier, their placement hidden in the terrain. If they wanted to find him, they'd have to bleed for it. The storm intensified, lightning flashing erratically, casting sharp, fleeting shadows over the rocks. Elias shifted slightly, his suit blending with the terrain, his rifle trained on a narrow pass to the west. The Silent Blades were out there, moving silently, using the storm to their advantage. But the storm wasn't their ally, it was his. A faint click. Elias's eyes flicked toward the sound, his muscles coiled. The tripwire had been triggered. He turned his scope toward the area and saw another faint shimmer, this one moving cautiously across the rocky ground. Elias smirked. Too slow, he whispered, lining up the shot. The shimmer paused as if sensing his aim, but it was too late. Another crack of thunder, another shimmer collapsed. 2 down. But this time, they reacted faster. A bolt of searing plasma arced toward his position, barely missing his shoulder. The rocks behind him exploded, sending shards flying. Elias rolled instinctively, his mind calculating the trajectory of the shot. They triangulated his position. Nice try, he muttered, crawling swiftly to a new vantage point. The Silent Blades would assume he was pinned, but he never stayed in one place long enough for them to capitalize. The storm continued to rage, masking the sound of his movements as he slipped into a narrow crevice overlooking a lower valley. The jagged terrain was both a curse and a blessing, providing countless places for ambushes, but also countless places to hide. A sudden flicker to his left caught his eye. Elias didn't turn immediately. Instead, he adjusted the angle of his rifle, aiming without looking directly at the target. He waited, heart steady, breath controlled. The shimmer moved closer. Too confident, Elias muttered, pulling the trigger. The shimmer collapsed, the faint outline of a humanoid figure flickering briefly before the cloaking field failed completely. 3 down. The remaining assassins didn't retreat. They regrouped. Elias felt it, the subtle shift in the air. These weren't ordinary killers. They were synchronized, their neural uplinks allowing them to act as one. They were adapting, recalibrating their approach. A low hum filled the air, barely perceptible over the storm. Elias froze. EMP. He yanked his rifle close, shutting down its electronic systems before the pulse could hit. The hum grew louder, then stopped abruptly. His HUD flickered, then died. "Cute," he said, pulling out his backup scope. The Silent Blades thought they'd even the odds by disabling his tech, but Elias had trained for worse. He adjusted his position again, now relying solely on the environment and his instincts. The storm's chaotic energy became his ally, its flashes of lightning illuminating the terrain in brief, blinding bursts. A sudden movement to his right. Elias swung his rifle, firing without hesitation. A cry of pain echoed through the storm, followed by silence. 4 down. The Silent Blades weren't just losing, they were unraveling. Their synchronization faltered, their movements growing erratic. Elias could feel it, the shift in the hunt. They were beginning to fear him. Another plasma bolt shot toward him, narrowly missing his leg. Elias dropped low, rolling into a shallow depression. The bolt had come from the east, but the angle was wrong. It wasn't a kill shot. A distraction? Elias scanned the area, his eyes catching a faint outline in the lightning's glow. 2 shimmers moved together, their cloaking fields overlapping. They were trying to flank him. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small device, a makeshift decoy rigged to emit a faint heat signature. He activated it, tossing it to the left. The shimmers paused, then shifted toward the decoy. Elias lined up his shot. The first shimmer fell, its companion hesitating just long enough for Elias to fire again. 5. 6. The storm began to abate, the wind slowing, the lightning growing less frequent. Elias stood slowly, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The Silent Blades were gone. His earpiece crackled to life, the signal weak but audible. "Then? Report." He smirked, his voice steady. "They missed. I didn't." The storm had turned vicious, a relentless roar of wind and lightning that masked even the faintest sound. Elias crouched in a shallow trench, scanning the jagged terrain through his scope. The Silent Blades were regrouping. He could feel it in the tense stillness between the bursts of thunder. They weren't retreating. That wasn't their way. No, they were adapting, recalibrating, preparing for another strike. He adjusted the scope, its analog mechanisms clicking softly. The EMP they'd unleashed earlier had taken out most of his advanced tech, but he wasn't worried. Elias had trained for this. No thermal optics, no auto-targeting, just instinct and skill. A faint flicker caught his eye, a shimmer that barely disturbed the air. He smiled grimly. They thought they were invisible, untouchable. They hadn't learned yet. His finger tightened on the trigger, steady as the rock beneath him. The shot cracked through the storm, sharp and clean. The shimmer faltered, collapsing into the outline of a figure clutching its chest before toppling into the dust. He counted silently. That made 4 down. Elias shifted, crawling along the trench to a new position. He never stayed in one spot for long, not with opponents like these. They'd already proven capable of triangulating his shots, and he wasn't about to give them a second chance. His boots crunched softly against the gravel as he slid into a new vantage point behind a jagged outcrop. His earpiece hissed faintly, a broken connection barely holding together. "Then, update, still operational?" He tapped the side of his helmet, just enough to jolt the connection into clarity. "Still operational," he said. 4 down, 2 at least still active. They're regrouping. I'll handle it. Command wants an evac. The voice crackled. Storm's getting worse. Extraction windows closing. Elias scanned the terrain, his scope sweeping methodically over the battlefield. Tell Command I'm not done yet. They send an evac team now. It'll be target practice for the Blades. Give me 30 minutes. A long pause followed. Then, acknowledged. 30 minutes. Don't miss. He smirked, shifting his focus back to the hunt. I never do. A sudden hiss, faint but distinct, cut through the wind, a high-pitched whine building in intensity. Elias froze, his ears straining against the storm. It was the unmistakable sound of a plasma bolt charging. His muscles coiled, his mind calculating the shot's trajectory before it even fired. The blast came from the east, a searing streak of light that lit up the sky. Elias rolled instinctively, the bolt slamming into the rocks where he'd just been crouching. Shards of stone exploded outward, pelting his suit with sharp fragments. He didn't stop moving, crawling low to the ground as another bolt sliced through the air, narrowly missing him. They're getting desperate, he muttered, slipping behind a natural barricade of boulders. The silent blades were revealing themselves, a sign they were starting to feel the pressure. Good. Desperation made them sloppy. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small device, a jury-rigged sensor calibrated to detect electromagnetic fluctuations. It wasn't much, but it would give him a rough idea of their positions. He activated it, the device emitting a faint pulse that rippled invisibly through the storm. 2 blips appeared on the analog screen, both moving fast and converging on his position. Elias grinned. They thought they had him cornered. Perfect. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and slid down into a narrow ravine, moving quickly but quietly. The ravine led to a choke point, a natural bottleneck between 2 massive rock formations. If they wanted to follow him, they'd have to come through here. Elias set to work, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. He rigged a pair of explosives to the rock walls, their charges concealed beneath loose rubble. It wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to distract. To give him the opening he needed. The storm's fury continued to grow, the wind whipping around him as he crouched in the shadows, waiting. The first shimmer appeared at the mouth of the ravine, a faint distortion that only someone like Elias could spot. He let it move closer, counting the seconds in his head. 3, 2, 1. He triggered the charges. The explosion was deafening, the force of it shaking the ground and sending a cascade of rocks tumbling down. The shimmer faltered, revealing a sleek figure in matte black armor, momentarily exposed as it stumbled back. Elias didn't hesitate. He fired once, the shot punching through the assassin's visor. 5 down. The second assassin reacted immediately, firing a plasma bolt into the rocks above him. The boulders groaned, shifting dangerously, but Elias was already on the move. He darted out of the ravine, using the storm to mask his escape. The assassin pursued, its cloaking field flickering as it moved erratically. Elias led it into the open, the terrain flattening out into a wide plateau. Lightning lit up the sky, casting harsh shadows over the battlefield. He turned, his rifle steady, his breathing calm. The assassin uncloaked, its armor gleaming in the storm's light. It stood taller than the others, its frame augmented with cybernetic enhancements. A low hum emanated from its body, a sign of the neural uplink that connected it to the Empire's command ship. "You're the last one," Elias said, his voice cutting through the wind. "You should have stayed hidden." The assassin didn't respond, its movements precise as it raised its weapon. Elias shifted slightly, his finger tightening on the trigger. The assassin fired first, a burst of plasma streaking toward him. Elias dodged, the bolt grazing his shoulder and scorching the edge of his suit. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain as he returned fire. The shot hit its mark, but the assassin's armor absorbed the impact. It lunged forward, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. Elias dropped his rifle, drawing his combat knife in one fluid motion. The fight was brutal, a clash of skill and raw power. The assassin's augmented strength was formidable, its strikes shattering the rocks around them. But Elias was faster, his movements fluid and deliberate. He ducked under a wild swing, driving his knife into a vulnerable joint in the armor. The assassin faltered, its neural uplink sparking as the knife severed critical connections. Elias pulled back, his hand finding the grip of his sidearm. He fired twice, the shots piercing the assassin's exposed neck. It collapsed, the storm raging around them as Elias stood over the body, breathing heavily. Then, His earpiece crackled. Status? He retrieved his rifle, slinging it over his shoulder, as he began the trek back to his outpost. Silent blades neutralized. Extraction can proceed. A pause. Then, acknowledged. Good work, sniper. Elias allowed himself a faint smile as the storm began to abate. They missed, he muttered. I didn't. The silence after the storm was deceptive, broken only by the faint hum of energy still crackling through the air. Elias crouched low, his rifle steady against the jagged terrain, scanning the dark horizon. He knew better than to trust the quiet. The silent blades weren't finished yet, and their patterns told him one thing: they were preparing for a final, decisive strike. His earpiece buzzed faintly, static cutting through the weak signal. Then, evac window closing. What's your status? Still breathing, he replied, his voice calm. Blades are down to their last one, maybe two. I'm not leaving until the job's done. We've got incoming interference from the Empire. The voice crackled. Orbital activity is spiking. You might be dealing with more than just foot soldiers soon. Elias let out a low breath, his mind racing. If the Empire was escalating, he needed to finish this quickly. Noted. Hold evac until I give the all-clear. He cut the connection before they could argue and returned his focus to the terrain. A faint flicker caught his eye, just a subtle distortion against the jagged rocks. He didn't react immediately, his fingers steady as he adjusted his scope. The silent blade was good, better than the others. It moved with precision, using the terrain's natural shadows to obscure its cloaking field. Clever, Elias muttered, tracking the movement. He resisted the urge to fire immediately. One shot could give away his position, and this assassin would be expecting that. He waited, his breathing slowing, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The flicker stopped, and for a moment, Elias thought the blade had sensed him. Then it moved again, just enough to confirm its position. He smiled faintly, exhaling as he pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and clean, but the assassin was faster. It darted to the side, the bullet grazing its armor but not finding its mark. Damn! Elias muttered, already shifting his position. The blade fired back, a streak of plasma slamming into the rock where he'd been. He rolled into a shallow crevice, his mind racing. This one wasn't just clever, it was calculating. The blade didn't pursue immediately. Instead, it began circling, forcing Elias to stay on the move. He could hear its faint footsteps, the slight crunch of gravel under its boots as it closed the noose around him. Elias reached into his pack, pulling out a small device. It was a makeshift motion sensor, crude but effective. He activated it, watching the tiny screen as it pulsed faintly. A red dot appeared, moving steadily closer. Gotcha, he whispered, slipping into the shadows. He moved quickly but silently, circling around to intercept the blade. The storm had left the ground slick, each step a calculated risk. He didn't have time to set traps or plan an ambush. This would have to be direct. The blade appeared in his sights, its cloaking field flickering as it scanned the terrain. Elias steadied his aim, but just as he was about to fire, the blade turned, its visor glowing faintly in the dim light. It fired first, forcing Elias to dive to the side as plasma scorched the air around him. He hit the ground hard, his rifle skidding out of reach. The blade didn't hesitate, closing the distance with alarming speed. Elias barely had time to draw his sidearm, firing off 2 quick shots. One struck the blade's armor, staggering it just enough for Elias to scramble to his feet. They faced off, the blade drawing a sleek, serrated blade that hummed with energy. Elias held his ground, his pistol steady. He knew he couldn't afford to miss. "You've been a pain in my ass all night," he said, his voice steady. "Let's finish this." The blade didn't respond. It lunged, the blade slicing through the air with deadly precision. Elias dodged, the edge grazing his shoulder as he fired again. The shot struck the blade's leg, but it didn't slow down. Elias rolled, grabbing a loose rock and hurling it at the assassin's head. It staggered, just enough for him to close the gap. He slammed into the blade, the impact driving them both to the ground. They grappled, the assassin's augmented strength nearly overwhelming him. The blade's knife slashed wildly, grazing Elias' side. He gritted his teeth, his free hand searching for anything he could use. His fingers closed around the hilt of his own knife, and he drove it into the gap between the blade's armor plates. The assassin let out a choke sound, its body convulsing as sparks erupted from the wound. Elias didn't let up, twisting the blade until the assassin went still. He rolled off, panting as he pressed a hand to his bleeding side. The blade's neural uplink was still sparking faintly, its connection to the Empire's command ship disrupted. Elias sat up slowly, pulling a small data module from the assassin's armor. If the uplink was still active, he could use it to pinpoint the ship's location. He activated the module, his helmet's interface flickering to life as coordinates appeared on the screen. Then, his earpiece crackled, the connection stronger now. "We've got activity in orbit. What's your status?" "Target neutralized," he replied, his voice steady despite the pain. "I've got their uplink. Sending coordinates now." He transmitted the data, leaning back against the rocks as the storm began to fade. "Tell the fleet to light them up." "Copy that. Evac inbound." Elias closed his eyes briefly, letting the tension drain from his body. The silent blades were finished, their mission a failure. He'd held the line, just as he always did. As the extraction team arrived, the storm finally subsided, the first rays of dawn breaking through the clouds. Elias stood, his rifle slung over his shoulder, and began the trek back to the outpost. "They missed," he muttered, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "I didn't." The air was still, heavy with the aftermath of the storm. The rocky expanse of Theros 4 felt eerily quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears and amplified every stray sound. Elias Venn crouched in the shadow of a jagged ridge, his rifle cradled against his chest. The blood from the wound on his side had slowed, congealing uncomfortably beneath his suit. Pain was an old companion, dulled by years of combat and tempered by necessity. He didn't have time for distractions. Not now. The last assassin was out there. He'd seen the shimmer, just for a second, darting between the rocks after their last exchange. It was moving differently now, more deliberate, slower. It was hunting, calculating every step. This one was better than the others, more patient. Elias adjusted his position, his movements methodical as he scanned the terrain. His earpiece buzzed faintly, the static punctuated by the voice of the outpost commander. "Then you need to extract. The fleet's reporting increased enemy activity in orbit. If you don't get out now, you might not get another chance." Elias stayed silent for a long moment, eyes fixed on the rocks ahead. His voice, when it came, was low and even. "Not yet. There's one left. You've done enough. Don't push this." Elias allowed himself a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "If I leave now, it follows me. I finish this here." He cut the connection before they could argue further, his focus narrowing to the task at hand. He shifted slightly, his finger resting lightly against the trigger. The storm had passed, but the residual haze from the electrical discharge created a shimmering mirage over the battlefield, making it harder to distinguish movement from distortion. Perfect cover for an assassin. And perfect bait for a sniper. The motion was subtle, just a ripple in the air against the backdrop of a distant outcrop. Elias didn't fire immediately. His instincts told him this was a trap, a feint meant to draw him out. He waited, his breathing slowing, his mind calculating angles, trajectories, and timing. The shimmer moved again, this time darting toward the left. A shadow detached itself from the rocks, and Elias felt the shift before he saw it. The assassin was circling behind him. He let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He'd anticipated this. The narrow pass he'd chosen wasn't just a defensive position, it was a trap. His eyes flicked toward the detonator hidden in the dirt at his feet. The charge was small, just enough to send a spray of shrapnel in a controlled direction. It wouldn't kill, but it would force the blade to reveal itself. He waited, counting silently in his head. 3, 2, 1. He pressed the detonator. The explosion was sharp, the sound ricocheting off the rocks. A figure flickered into view, its cloaking field disrupted by the shockwave. The assassin was thrown sideways, rolling across the uneven ground before regaining its footing. Elias moved instantly, his rifle snapping up to track the target. The assassin was fast, its augmented reflexes allowing it to dodge behind a boulder before he could get a clear shot. "Smart," Elias muttered, his voice barely audible. He shifted again, crawling along the edge of the ridge to find a better angle. His mind raced, analyzing the blade's movements. It wasn't just retreating, it was repositioning, trying to force him into a vulnerable spot. The assassin fired, the plasma bolt slicing through the air with a high-pitched whine. Elias ducked, the shot missing his head by inches and leaving a scorch mark on the rock behind him. He fired back, not to hit but to suppress, the crack of his rifle echoing in the stillness. The blade didn't fall for it. It moved again, disappearing into the shadows, its cloaking field flickering as it darted between cover. Elias gritted his teeth, the edges of his vision narrowing as adrenaline coursed through him. He couldn't afford to play defense any longer. He had to end this. He reached into his pack, pulling out a smoke canister. The blade's cloaking field would be useless in the thick haze, and Elias was betting on his own instincts to guide the final exchange. He pulled the pin and tossed the canister, the plume of smoke billowing out quickly, engulfing the narrow pass. The air grew dense, visibility dropping to almost nothing. Elias moved swiftly, his steps silent as he circled to higher ground. The blade would assume he was staying low, using the smoke as cover. It wouldn't expect him to climb. The seconds stretched, each one heavy with the anticipation of violence. Elias reached the top of the ridge, his rifle ready. The smoke below shifted, the faintest ripple betraying the assassin's position. It was moving cautiously, its head swiveling as it searched for him. Elias didn't hesitate. He fired once, the shot punching through the haze and finding its mark. The assassin stumbled, its cloaking field failing completely as it dropped to one knee. But it wasn't dead. Not yet. It raised its head, its visor cracked but glowing faintly as it turned toward him. With a burst of impossible speed, it lunged, closing the distance in seconds. Elias dropped his rifle, drawing his knife in one fluid motion. The impact was brutal, the blade slamming into him with enough force to knock the air from his lungs. They hit the ground hard, the blade's strength threatening to overwhelm him. Its knife slashed toward his throat, and Elias barely deflected the blow, the edge grazing his shoulder instead. He twisted, driving his own knife upward into the blade's side. The assassin convulsed, sparks flying as its neural uplink malfunctioned. Elias didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He wrenched the knife free and stabbed again, this time into the base of its neck. The blade went still, its body collapsing heavily onto the ground. Elias rolled away, panting, his vision swimming. He pressed a hand to his bleeding shoulder, his other hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. His earpiece buzzed, the voice of the commander cutting through the haze. "Then, do you copy? Orbital scans confirm the area's clear. Are you secure?" Elias sat up slowly, his gaze fixed on the lifeless body of the assassin. "Secure," he said, his voice hoarse. "Mission complete. Evac team is en route. ETA 5 minutes. Elias nodded to himself, his grip on his rifle tightening as he stood. The smoke was beginning to dissipate, revealing the jagged landscape in sharp relief. He stared down at the assassin one last time, his expression unreadable. "They missed," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't." As the sound of approaching engines broke the silence, Elias turned away, his steps steady despite the pain. He'd done what he came to do, and for now, that was enough.